Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Interdisciplinary Forum on Fake News and Alternative Facts. This is the fourth, or maybe the fifth, in a series that seeks to bring together people from a variety of disciplines on campus to talk about important topics. This series is the brainchild of Lily Greiner, who should be recognized there in the back. She's putting out the food. She organized these. It's her brainchild. She does everything from getting the speakers lined up to buying the food. So I think this is a wonderful thing she's doing. My name is Eric Lindquist. I'm going to be moderating. I'm a history and humanities librarian here. As a student of history, I feel the need to point out that anxiety about the truth of news, misplaced or not, is probably as old as news itself, and that alternative facts are probably also as old as facts themselves. I'm sure that we can all think of what seemed to us, to most of us, unreasoning disagreement with accepted facts, and some of these are of long standing. The idea that Shakespeare's plays were written by someone or someones other than Shakespeare has been around since the 19th century. A passion for news was already evident in Europe in the 16th century, and the newsletters from the time show a pronounced concern about the credibility of news sources. A Victorian novel I happen to have been reading recently provides evidence that newspapers have long been read skeptically. A character reading an obituary of a beloved teacher observes, quote, "It may be false, a mere newspaper lie." This was written in 1857. On the other hand, some people have always been perhaps too credulous about what they read or read. In 1679, at a time of heightened political excitement in England, with the press pouring out topical pamphlets by the hundreds, one observer noted, quote, "Every idle voter will believe a lie in print rather than an honest neighbor." Again, this is quite old. Fake news or anxiety about news and alternative facts have been around for a long time then, but concern about them has obviously been heightened recently. The internet and social media have changed the landscape. It's one thing for people to believe something because it is in print when there was not that much print. It's another thing to believe something you read on the internet because it's on the internet when the internet is everywhere. And political shifts have, of course, had huge effects as well. Today we will be hearing from a variety of experts on this subject of increasing interest. Each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes. We want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. I will introduce the speakers one at a time. It is appropriate that our first speaker be a representative of the libraries. The libraries are the organizers of this series, and today's topic is of special concern to the libraries. We think of ourselves as, in a sense, the guardians of true knowledge. Of course, we are not the only people on campus or at the university who think of themselves that way. One of our principal tasks is trying to help students think critically about the sources they use for their papers and other projects. The librarian probably most closely involved in this effort is Rachel Gammons, who is the head of teaching and learning. One of her principal responsibilities is leading information literacy programming for first-year students. She has an MS in information science from the University of Tennessee and is currently pursuing her PhD in student affairs here at the university. So, Rachel.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I think this is a really important topic. As I was preparing my remarks today, I was thinking about fake news, but I was also thinking about the current social and political moment that's allowing this discourse to thrive, and specifically the library's role within that conversation. As Eric mentioned, my work is in teaching, so I'm also thinking of this from the perspective of a teacher, just to sort of frame the next 6 minutes we're going to have together. So libraries occupy this really interesting space in society. If you look at public perception of libraries, you'll see that it's tied to public libraries, because that's the library that people associate with the most. They take their children to it for story time. They attended it as children. It's a part of their communities, and there's a really interesting link between libraries and education. So people feel very strongly that the programs and resources that libraries have should directly reinforce what's happening within our school system. And the same thing is true for civic engagement. So people that attend library programming, that use library resources, are more likely to be engaged in solving a problem in their local community. They're more likely to participate in local governance, and the correlation rises for people that use their library in person versus electronically. So libraries are a beloved part of our society, but they're also very misunderstood, and they occupy this controversial space, I think, in this dialogue in particular. In the media over the last 6 months to a year, I think in particular, libraries have been associated as on the forefront in the battle against fake news, and I think that very specifically that's how it's been phrased, in the battle against fake news. And although I think people would identify a connection between libraries and fake news, they may not be able to articulate why that association exists. Allison Head is the head of the Project of Information Literacy, which is a national research study looking at college students and information behavior. And she did an article with John Whitby on the era of factual recession. And what they write is that the circumstances, which is fake news and alternate facts, call for a systemic approach or the mobilization of 3 classes of knowledge professionals, which includes librarians, teachers, and journalists, trained in what they describe as old school ethics and neutrality. And they identify these 3 groups as the triad of truth workers. So again, we have this association between libraries and education, but it also pulls out to include journalists or people that create information. And what I find really interesting about that statement is the word neutrality, because I believe that neutrality in this sense is not an abdication of responsibility in having a critical conversation, and it's not tacit agreement with one or more viewpoints. It's really a much more involved process. Barbara Pfister is a very famous academic librarian, and she describes neutrality as approaching a question with an open mind, being willing to let evidence influence what you think, being committed to a method for truth-seeking that minimizes bias and harm, and doing this for the public good, not out of self-interest, which is very different than giving equal weight to beliefs that are not true, which is what we often see neutrality as, or at least that's framed that way in our society. So the focus is really on how information is created and having a critical conversation about our role within that process. So I think neutrality in this sense is not so much an abdication of responsibility, but it's looking at truthfulness, openness, honesty, transparency, and is more closely aligned with objectivity than neutrality. And if you look at information systems, I think there's often an association with information as neutral, as if what is on the page did not come from a person or out of a system that's involved with social, political, and economic injustice and inequality. So information literacy, which the libraries are deeply involved in, is one of our primary roles. Information literacy is the ability to identify an information need, locate, use, and evaluate information. This concept comes up in the 80s with the rise of electronic resources, but you can find it referenced earlier than that as well. And what's interesting is our discourse is moving from information literacy to critical information literacy, which adds to this conversation. These social, political, economic, and corporate systems that have power and influence over information production, dissemination, access, and consumption. So it's really looking at the co-construction of knowledge, at the mutually participatory process between librarians or truth workers and educators and students, in challenging our belief systems and looking critically at the kind of societal and social and political inequality that we have around us and how that influences the information that's created, used, and inserted into our knowledge. It also asks librarians, and I think also educators, to challenge ourselves to acknowledge our own complicity in forwarding these systems of inequality. So it pushes us to a place, a dialogue that I think perhaps we've been reticent to embrace previously. Our framework for information literacy, which is how many of you are familiar with information literacy? Okay, so all the librarians raised their hands. So information literacy is very much engaged in who we are as librarians, but it extends to other disciplines as well. And the libraries has a framework for information literacy, which is forwarded by the Association of College and Research Libraries. We have 6 different frames for information literacy, and I pulled out just 2 because we have 2 minutes left. The first is my favorite phrase in the whole world, which is that authority is constructed and contextual. So information literacy is teaching students to be skeptical consumers and responsible producers of information. And recent media on libraries, I think, has often been associated with an evaluating information checklist. So they'll say libraries are really important because they teach students to evaluate information using the CRAP method, which is currency, relevancy, accuracy, authority, and purpose, or using critic, or using the 5 W's. But critical information literacy really resists the simplification of these checklists as if something is good or bad, right or wrong, popular or scholarly, really embraces that ambiguity that's in the middle, which is what I'm really excited about. It also asks us to challenge authority not only as the person that created that information, but also our own authority as users of information, as educators, as consumers, as purchasers, as people that provide access. So it's a much more complicated view of how authority is constructed and contextual. The second is information creation as process. Evaluating information will often look at the product over the process, and it will divorce the content from the context in which it was created, which obviously takes away all of the important things we need to look at when we're considering truth and what's real and what's not real. And it asks us to question things, not only what kind of source is it, but who created it, who funded it, who has access to it, who benefits from this information being out and accessible. So it's a much more nuanced conversation that we're having about information, and it really resists the wholesale endorsement of information as good or bad, real or true, really untrue or fake, popular and scholarly, and embraces uncertainty as a part of a learning process, which is what I love about libraries, is that we really do inhabit that sticky gray space that's not black or white. So the focus that I'm interested in, and I'm really interested in here from my panelists, is not on fake news. I mean, it is fake news. But it's also the systems that allow this conversation to happen, on the structures that we've created that forward these kind of systems of information. So libraries fitting into this process, I will make a bold claim and say that I think they fit everywhere. So I think we're involved in creating information, collecting, accessing, using, that we're a part of each of those systems. And academic libraries in particular, we provide safe spaces and community. But more than that, we empower our users to live productive, well-informed lives. And I think our mission is, as educators, beyond anything else. I mean, we certainly provide access to information, but I think that we teach people how to evaluate and use that information, whereas that's the role that I see for us having in fake news, is that we provide access to resources. We do not necessarily vet them in terms of saying that you can find all kinds of biased sources in a library database, just like you can in a Google database. So really looking critically at our information consumers and teaching them how to approach that process thoughtfully and mindfully. Okay, thanks.
Yes. Do we have access to the Al Gore's amazing internet here?
Is there access to that?
Yeah.
I mean, is it easy to bring up here? If it's not, I can just talk.
Just thought I'd show one thing.
Okay, sorry.
You can introduce me properly, I'll just sit here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We probably could get the internet up, but it might
That's okay, no,
just be all right. All right, anyway, the second speaker is Jamie McIntyre, who is a journalist. Actually has an MA in journalism from the University of Maryland, where his master's thesis examined conspiracy theories and whether facts matter. He joined the Washington Examiner in April 2016 as senior writer for defense and national security. His newsletter, Jamie McIntyre's Daily on Defense, goes out each weekday morning to tens of thousands of national security professional and opinion leaders. He served as CNN's military affairs and senior Pentagon correspondent from 1992 to 2008. And Al Jazeera's Al Jazeera America's national security correspondent from 2014 to 2016. He began his career in broadcasting at WTOP and was also a newscaster for NPR's flagship news program, All Things Considered, from 2011 to 2014. So,
All right, so the good news is I don't have any slides, although I'd love your slides. So how do I just blank the screen here? Not that I don't love this slide, but anyway, I don't know how to do it either. Thanks. All right, so hi, I'm Jay. So first of all, does anybody have a watch? You have a watch? You can tell me when it's 7 minutes up?
I will.
Give me a big sign, because I can talk on this subject forever. So I got really interested in this idea of, it wasn't called fake news back then, but this idea that why people believe things that are demonstrably untrue from a personal experience. I'm just going to tell you about that experience. It goes back to September 11th, 2001. And as you heard from my resume, I was the Pentagon correspondent at CNN the day the airplane hit the building. American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Dulles, hit the side of the Pentagon. I was in the Pentagon and reporting on the events of that day. And I'm gonna just shrink this down to the bare minimum, so I won't bore you too much. But in the course of my coverage that day, I uttered these fateful words. I said during one of my reports, "I can tell you from my close-up inspection, there's no sign a plane crashed anywhere near the Pentagon." I actually said that. Even though that I had been up to the site and I had seen all the pieces of the plane, and I knew that a plane had hit the Pentagon. And these fateful words I uttered in the course of a long day of coverage became part of the conspiracy theories that surrounded September 11th, specifically about the Pentagon and whether a plane hit the Pentagon. And there was an internet documentary, I think you can still find it, it's called Loose Change. It's been through about 4 or 5 iterations. But in this documentary, this segment of mine, this little clip of me, about 12 seconds long, was evidence that a reporter had been to the scene and seen no evidence of a plane hitting the building, despite the official government cover-up that claimed a plane hit the building. And also in this documentary was a clip from somebody I had interviewed that day. And I didn't see the plane hit the building because I was inside the building. But I found an eyewitness who had seen the plane hit, and he was very dramatic. He'd been driving along Route 27, which, if you're familiar, it's the road that goes right by between the Pentagon and Arlington Cemetery, the side where the plane hit. And he had seen it, and he was describing how he was driving along and he knew something was wrong because the plane came in, it was so low, it was just, it was like treetop level. And he could see the plane and he could see the windows, and it crashed into this, and he described it to me. He said, you know, the plane came in, it looked like a cruise missile going into the side of the building. So in this internet documentary that I got inadvertently inserted in was also this clip of him saying it looked like a cruise missile going into the side of the building. So there was a clip of me saying there's no evidence of a plane, and him saying it looked like a cruise missile. Well, I'm beginning to watch this and doubt whether there actually was a plane, because here's 2 eyewitnesses that say no. So just to back up a minute, so you know what happened here, right? These were comments that were taken out of context. My comment came, I was doing a report, I was being debriefed by Judy Woodruff, who's now an anchor at the PBS NewsHour. And Judy said to me, as I was giving my report, Jamie, what about these reports that we heard a plane crashed nearby, short of the Pentagon? And I said, well, Judy, I can tell you from my close-up inspection, there's no sign a plane crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only crash site is behind me here, where you can see the Pentagon. So when these conspiracy theories started floating around, I pretty much ignored them at first. I mean, it was pretty silly, really. We all knew a plane had hit the Pentagon. There were real people on the plane. It took off from the airport. People even made phone calls before the plane crashed. The pieces of the plane were there. I mean, any fool, a blind man in the dark, could see that a plane had hit the Pentagon. But I was surprised because over time these conspiracy theories gained a lot more strength. And one of them was this clip of me. So I began to engage with some of the 9/11 truthers who were using this clip of me to make their point. And I figured, you know, if I explained to any rational person that this was just taken out of context and that the plane clearly had hit the Pentagon, that they would change their mind. And the thing that was shocking to me, and this was consistent over 10 years, was I talked to dozens and dozens of the people who didn't believe a plane hit the Pentagon. I explained to them my firsthand account. I explained what was going on with this, and I never once changed anybody's mind. And this was really surprising to me because, you know, you mentioned this conspiracy about who wrote Shakespeare's plays. Well, you could debate that forever because we don't have all the information to know that. You know, the conspiracy about who put Oswald up to shooting Kennedy, you can debate that for years too. But you don't have, but we know a plane hit the Pentagon. This really wasn't a seriously debatable point. But yet, no matter how many facts and arguments I marshaled, I couldn't change a single mind. So I wrote my thesis about this, and we'll talk about more during the Q&A session, but I came to this very library, and I checked out a book that was written by Popular Science called Debunking 9/11 Myths, where the editors of Popular Science had gathered all the facts available to dispute all these crazy myths about 9/11. At the same time, I checked out another book from this very same library. It was called Debunking 9/11 Myths, in which 6 months later another book came out disputing every single fact in the first book, which illustrates the problem about, as a journalist, if you believe your job is to bring facts to bear, help people understand the context, so that we can agree on a sort of a universal understanding of what the problem is before we debate how to solve it, and you can't change anyone's mind with facts, that's a real conundrum. And that's the one I'm dealing with. I just mentioned one more point, and then we'll get into the Q&A when we talk this. But you may have noticed that the winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics this year was a gentleman whose work was on behavioral economics. And basically, the work is describing how human beings are not rational and don't act rationally and don't make decisions rationally. And that is one of the underlying factors that I saw in the research that I did. My thesis, by the way, if you want to read it, it's called Elements of Disbelief, a case study of 9/11 truthers and the persistence of misinformation in the digital age. You can find it at elementsofdisbelief.blogspot.com. You can just Google Elements of Disbelief. It's all there. And I've said before, that's a very academic sounding name, but if I ever write a book about it, I've decided to call it Stuck on Stupid, Why Smart People Believe Dumb Things. As I said, I could carry this whole discussion myself, but I'm going to sit down and pass the baton. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ernesto Calvo, who is professor and associate chair of the Department of Government and Politics here at the university. He is the author of Legislator Success in Fragmented Congresses in Argentina and other works, and has published widely in US, European, and Latin American journals. His research on political representation, elections, and congresses has received several awards, including from the Political Economy section of the American Political Science Association.
So, core of the presentation is we're generally discussing about false news, and being an education institution, our concern generally has to be with the truth. But when we think about fake news, I think that the key to this is understanding fake news as a behavior, as a political decision where there's an objective that is to exercise a particular type of power. And when we think about, for example, with Willie, we know there's a message. When a bully, takes a finger and put it in the ear of somebody, we don't think that the message to that is to communicate information about the intent. The bully is not saying, I'm a bully, at least not in those terms. So the question is, when we think about fake news, are we thinking on a particular type of activity that is trying to transmit a message, or is trying to transmit a position of power? And those two things are sometimes difficult to distinguish. So I was putting it as an example when we think about the Pizzagate shooter that went to DC and took on a pizzeria trying to supposedly save a number of kids on a ring of pedophiles that was led by Hillary Clinton. When the Pizzagate was created as a message, was the idea to get someone to go to the pizzeria and actually go with the guns and try to clear and save those kids from the pedophiles? Or was the idea not for anyone to go there and actually do that? So the individual that went to the pizzeria in that case did not actually get the memo. The memo didn't say you have to go to the pizzeria to clear these kids. The memo said we're engaging in some type of information that is producing a distraction in the campaign, and that distraction in the campaign is producing some other type of content that we are interested in disseminating. So when we think about fake news, generally we're not thinking about false news, we're thinking about news that are trying to impose some types of message, that are trying to convey that I can lie and I can exercise power without that power being challenged as such, and that's the kind of message that I'm relaying. So one example of a nice fake news that was discussed in the New York Times recently was right after Trump was inaugurated. So there was protesters supposedly that were not organic to Austin, that were protesting against Trump, and a tweet by Eric Tucker was published and went viral, absolutely viral. So the tweet was produced by an individual that was not in a political campaign. He just saw the trucks, and when he saw the trucks, he connected the dots, and the dots said there's a protest against Trump, and there's buses here, so the protest should not be organic, so he produces a tweet. And one of the key things about fake news is that they're not produced oftentimes with the purpose of being fake news. They're produced as news that are taken by a machine that distributes that news. But there's millions of fake news that could be taken. Generally I capture tweets, and those tweets are 500 millions of tweets a day. And in those 500 millions of tweets, there's very large number of tweets that are fake news, but not all of them actually go ballistics. Not all of them become viral. So in order to become viral, they have to be taken as a message, and they have to be communicated as such. So the key question is, why is it that some messages are taken and go viral, and why some other messages do not? And that's very different from the assumption that what we're seeing is a question of a false news being created, and that false news that is being created is being accepted as a news by a part of the community as just pure information. So we have plenty of examples of fake news being taken as a message in itself. So for example, when Donald Trump says network news has become so partisan, distorted, and fake that licenses must be challenged and, if appropriate, revoked, not fair to the public, what is the message trying to say? In this case, the message by Trump is that the news should not be believed. Is he trying to communicate a particular type of content, like for example, news that are being published by these news outlets are false? Or is the message that you should actually take on those news outlets and take them down? Is the argument here that you can produce a message that is trying to deliver a content about what you should expect when you read the news? Or is he a call to action? Okay? So in that case, we are seeing, for example, that messages that take on fake news by the Republicans are reducing the credibility. This graph that you have here shows that the number of people that believe that the media is producing fair, good, credible information has been going down, and it has been going down dramatically among Republicans. So the argument that news are fake is hitting particularly intensely among Republicans and not among Democrats. So Democrats generally do not believe that these fake news reflect on the media, but actually reflect on the individual that is producing the messages. A lot of Republicans think that this reflects on the media. Now, when they say that they think that this reflects on the media, do they actually believe this? Or is this like a wet willy? Now let me present an example. So many of you, I imagine, saw these pictures. One is the inauguration of Trump, and the other one is the inauguration of Obama. So in the inauguration of Trump, there was considerably fewer people, is the one that is over there, and the inauguration of Obama had considerably more people. So they asked a number of respondents which one was the inauguration of Trump. And a lot of respondents say, when they were Republicans, that this was the inauguration of Trump. And a lot of Democrats said that that was the inauguration of Trump. So then they went ahead and asked which one has more people. This is the inauguration of Obama, and that one is the inauguration of Trump. Which one has more people? Now, a significant number of people said that one, Trump's inauguration, had more people. So when they were seeing this image, they were reporting that they saw more people on that side. Now the big question here is not whether they are lying. The big question is which ones are actually seeing more people there than here, and how many of those that are saying that there's more people there are doing it because they're expressing a different type of message. So if I, for example, I'm a Republican, I receive a message that says which one has more, which one is the Trump inauguration, which one has more people, and they say that's Trump inauguration, which one has more people. I am a Republican, I know that this is a liberal survey and it's trying to get to me, so what I'm gonna say is that one has more people. Am I saying it because I don't understand the message? Am I saying because I believe a lie? Or am I saying it because I'm giving you the finger? This is a wet willy to the one that is asking the question. So when we're trying to discriminate fake news, we have to distinguish that individuals oftentimes are not really believing fake news, but they understand the message. And the message is not, you should believe this. The message is, I am conducting an act of political aggression, I am being a bully, and please enjoy it. So when we see the bully, and we see that this message from the bully is spread in one community and not other. So this is, for example, the travel ban, and in the travel ban, the red was Republican, the blue was Democrats, and we could see that different hashtags activate in different areas. So we know that science, when they propagate, they tend to propagate everywhere, but fake news, when they propagate only on one community. So we can see to what extent news that are believed to be true or not are propagating in only one of those two communities. The question is, why is it that when they see those tweets, Republicans, when they see the tweets of the travel ban, why is that when we ask how they feel, 48%, 49%, 41% feel joyful? Why is it that the information that describes events that they agree with, but are demonstrably false, or events that they agree, but they're not really to be joyful? They're political events. Why is it that they understand the joke? And why is it that Democrats, when they're reading the same thing, they feel disgusted? So when we read fake news, the big question that we have to ask is, when I read that news, does it make me think that that is surprising? Or it makes me angry? Does that make me feel that I'm happy? Or it makes me, look, the Earth is going at this speed around the sun. So most of the fake news is not really destined for you to understand that this is true or that this is false. It's to make you, raise your pulse. Either you're a Democrat and when you read it, you're pissed. Or you're a Republican and when you read it, you're gleeful. And I had this discussion with this alt-right individual where he was telling me about the 3 million voters, undocumented voters that voted in favor of Hillary Clinton in the election. And he was not, surprising, 3 million voters actually voted for Hillary in the election. He was smirking. He was happy telling me about that. And the reason he was telling me about that in a very happy disposition is because he knew that it was not true. He was just doing a wet willy to me. So with fake news, we have to discriminate those two things, and we have to find a way to actually see what type of content is information and what type of content is a political message. So the objective is very different from transmitting information. Sorry about going a couple of minutes over.
Our next speaker is Scott Roberts, who is the Director of Instructional Excellence and Innovation for the university's Teaching and Learning Transformation Center, and an affiliate senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology. He received his PhD in social psychology here at this university. After 2 years as a research psychologist for the federal government, he returned to Maryland and served as the psychology department's director of undergraduate studies. Aside from his administrative duties, Dr. Roberts teaches undergraduate courses including introductory psychology and the psychology of evil.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, this debate about fake news really comes down to a fundamental struggle that we have with reality, which is that it's difficult and it's complicated. And what is often so appealing about information is the way it makes us feel, which is a point that was just made. And we want to feel good, we want to feel right. So to understand what's really going on a social, psychological level, we have to understand the brain and what's inside each of your skulls and what it's designed to do. And it is a truly remarkable organ, and it is capable of things that are really even hard to wrap our own minds around. But it also has limitations. It evolved to do certain things for us very well. But we have a lot of misconceptions about what our brain does. And there's a lot that we don't even really have any awareness or control over. And so one of the things that I always really want my students of psychology to understand is that in many ways, you yourself are a mere observer of your mental processes. You are watching your brain think. You are experiencing things that are going on and reacting to them. You are not necessarily always in complete control of what you think and why you think it. So I like the iceberg analogy in that there certainly are things that we carefully consider, things we think about, things we're aware of, right? The explicit decisions that we believe that we make. But I believe that that really accounts for a very small percentage of what our brain actually does, because underneath the surface is everything that we don't have awareness or control over. Our heuristics, the rules that we use to make simple decisions every single day, the biases that we have towards things and categories and individuals, ego protection, the idea that we want to feel good about ourselves, we want to like ourselves, and we're very motivated to protect our ego when it's threatened, and even our emotions, why we feel what we feel in the moment. And so my point is that a lot of what's underlying our reaction to information, in particular to fake news, is happening below the surface. It's happening on a very basic psychological level in a fraction of a second. And when we talk about evaluating sources in psychology, we think a lot about credibility. Is this a valid source of information? Should I believe this? Can I trust it? And when you think about the context of how people are being exposed to this, they're scrolling through social media, they're flipping through channels, they're watching story after story, they're hearing conversation after conversation. And we're making judgments in an instant about how credible a source of information is. We're doing this on a subconscious level without even really thinking or trying. And to give you a sense of how fast this is happening, all right, in some research studies they've demonstrated, I'm going to add a black square on the screen that's going to take exactly 1 second to appear. All right, that's a second. You are consciously able to perceive that unit of time. Well, some research is indicating that you make judgments about the credibility of a source within 1/20th of a second. This is happening so fast, you can't consciously perceive that unit of time, and yet within that fraction of a second, your brain has already decided whether or not this looks good to you. And that's true whether we're looking at a Facebook article or a news post or a blog or a person. You are instantly appraising them for whether or not they are going to be an expert and credible. And so all you need to do is make a website look like a real website, and within a fraction of a second, most people, if they're not really motivated to scrutinize it, are willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. And there's all sorts of fun examples of like foreign governments sharing parody news stories because it looked like a legitimate news site. And I like this cartoon that illustrates an important aspect of what's going on here. You have someone saying, I heard the rhetoric from both sides, time to do my own research for the real truth. Goes on Google or Googie. Literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe, jackpot. Right? And this speaks towards this idea of the confirmation bias. And this is a core fundamental concept in psychology, that we are motivated to be right, which means that we selectively notice the information that confirms what we believe. If you have a stereotype, and I bet every single one of you probably has a stereotype about a certain demographic of people that are bad drivers. There's probably some group that you think just aren't as good on the road. So when you see a person from that group driving in an unresponsible way, you notice it. Meanwhile, you've ignored all of the people that look just like you that are also driving like jerks. Or all the people that look like them that are doing just fine. So you selectively pay attention to the things that confirm and validate your beliefs. You selectively remember the instances, the news stories, the examples, even if they're the minority of cases, that support what you already think. And you selectively interpret ambiguous things as consistent. If there's somebody that you don't particularly like very much and you see them not hold the door for somebody that was behind them, you think, you see? What a jerk. Of course, when you did it, it was because, oh, I didn't see them. Or, oh, I had my hands full. Or, oh, they looked like they didn't want my help. Right? So we look at the world and we manipulate our own thinking about it to be consistent with what we want it to say. And another kind of striking research finding that comes out of this, it goes even further, is this what we call the backfire effect. And it basically turns out that if you take somebody that deeply believes something, like these kinds of fake news stories, like these myths, and you think, okay, we can fix this, we just have to tell them the truth. Not only does it not work, it actually goes in the opposite direction. So in one classic study, they found individuals who already believed in things that had been debunked. For example, that Obamacare would create death panels, that Saddam Hussein directly caused 9/11 terrorist attacks, or that Obama was born in Kenya. And they presented these individuals with a news article that refuted this myth. And what they found was that if you already deeply believe this, if it was core to some aspect of your ideology or personality, and you saw information that showed it was wrong, later on you believed the myth even more. You double down, because accepting that you were wrong is a threat to your ego, and nobody wants to feel wrong. So instead they convince themselves that the source is biased, the information is manipulation, and I must be right if they're trying to convince me otherwise. And so what it really boils down to when we talk about motivated cognition is that the more that someone wants to believe something to be true, the more you're going to believe it. Right? The more you want it, the more real it is. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Andrew Wolven, who is professor in the Department of Communication and executive director of the Oral Communication Program. His research interests center on issues dealing with listening behavior, communication education, and communication management. He is author, co-author, or editor of 6 books about listening and other subjects in communication. The International Listening Association recently presented him with a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work in listening.
Thank you very much. It's interesting as we think about the process of listening that I should point out to you that I study it, I don't necessarily do it. And my son always used to make the point, you're going off to tell people about what? But at any rate, it's interesting as we think about it in terms of where we are culturally in American society, in that during the endless presidential campaign, the New York Times ran a series of profiles on the various Republican candidates, and the photo that accompanied the profile of Senator Rand Paul had a caption under the photo saying that he talks with this executive from Target. And he's not talking with, he's listening to. And yet in our society we don't really think about listening to, and we look at it, if we think about it at all, as really very much a passive act that is part of what we just sort of do as a throwaway. That communication is all about talking to, talking with. So what I like to look at is the complexity of listening from the standpoint of how within a nanosecond we go through a number of stages, beginning with, of course, receiving the message, not just the auditory hearing part of it, but also particularly the visual part, as Scott was identifying in terms of the way that we respond to a lot of visual messages. Indeed, there's research in education that points out that After the first 5 minutes of the first day of class, you could distribute the course evaluations and get the same numbers that you would get at the very end of the course, because that initial impression is a lasting impression, and it comes very much through the visual channels. I do a course in listening behavior here, and I find it an interesting challenge to convince my students that it's more than hearing. But ultimately, by the end of the semester, hopefully they're on board with me. But it's not just receiving the message, of course, it's attending to, and the cognitive research on attention, as Scott points out, suggests that it is indeed very, very limited in terms of where we are. And where we are in education, we used to think, well, we could talk for about 20 minutes as a lecture and then break up the format with an activity and so forth. My students and I think we're probably down to 10 minutes. And my grandchildren and my grandchildren are very much on their parents' iPhones, probably would suggest that it's more like 8 minutes in terms of the next generation coming into our college classrooms. But the attention process, limited as it is very much impacted, of course, also by the way that we perceive the message from the standpoint of the frame of reference that we bring to the message. And it's probably that frame of reference that has a tremendous impact on the way that we're processing alternative facts, the way we're processing fake news. And that I think I do a lot of work as a consultant in intelligence agencies. And as we brief on the Hill, as we brief at the White House and so forth, we have to really work very hard sometimes at reframing what we understand in terms of what the data will tell us in the region on the ground, which may or may not conform with what it is that's expected in terms of creating the next political agenda or the next Pentagon agenda. And then ultimately we interpret the message in order to respond to it, both internally, in terms of cognitively what we put into our working memory to be able to use, as well as the external response to the message. So all of that, it seems to me, adds up to then a look at some work by Petty and Cacioppo, who looked some time ago at a dual processing model of persuasive discourse. And their dual processing model, it seems to me, conveys very much to what we understand or should understand about the way that we listen. In that a lot of it is, they suggest, peripheral, in that we don't really fully attend to it. We don't really fully make use of it and put it into the working memory in order to be able to use it at another time. However, there is then the central processing, which would be the left-hand side of the model, where we would, because of our engagement, our ego involvement, the need for the information that we're receiving, we would attend more fully and it would be processed more centrally. And I think that dual processing model is a really important way to reflect on then what happens as we attempt to listen to any sort of political discourse. I like to go one step further, and I like to suggest that also there's probably a taxonomy of listening that we can look at that provides an understanding as to where we are in terms of the level of listening in which we are engaged. My editor one time created a listening tree, which sort of strains, but it does give kind of a visual reinforcement for the idea that at the root of listening, we listen discriminatively in order to discern, in order to get the auditory, the visual, the sensory message. And there are times, of course, where we limit it to that. We don't go further. But of course, in the academic environment, we go much further in terms of then listening for comprehension, which is really kind of the trunk of it all, in that listening to understand and listening to gain information that we can use at another time. And then at a higher order, there are three levels that are not within a hierarchy, but are pretty co-equal, in that sometimes we listen therapeutically, or we should listen therapeutically, to provide an empathetic response to a person who's talking through a problem, who has an issue, and so forth. That's a tough one, because we very much want to tell everybody else what to do, and so we become more advisors than we are listeners sometimes in terms of empathetic listening. Then the key form of listening that conveys to what we're talking about here today would be critical listening, in terms of making some assessment, some judgment as to the credibility of the message, the truthfulness of the message, the authoritativeness of the message, the expertise of it, any of a numbers of factors that would work to help us understand whether we accept or reject the message. But as Scott pointed out, we come to it with a lot of cognitive predisposition to accept or reject, and so lots of times we don't really fully engage in it. A fifth order of listening in terms of that also would be listening for appreciation, which we would do as we entered the building, there was a flute player outside, and the music was just really, really very calming, and I appreciated it very much. So we have sort of a theoretical foundation for what we do as listeners, and then related to what we're looking at in terms of listening to fake news, our value system is going to sort of guide where we go in terms of how we handle it. And unfortunately, I think today another issue that we have to reflect on is the level of intolerance that we bring to messages, in that I'm concerned that listening in civil society is sort of going out the window, as there's a lot of intolerance that is sort of forming how much we're willing to or not willing to listen. And of course, technology, in that we're overwhelmed with information because there is so much out there, and it becomes that much more of a challenge for us in order to manage it, in order to make some decisions about it. So as we have these barriers to listening, and as we think about it in terms of where we want to go with listening, I would commend a couple of pieces to you. One was in the New Yorker by Elizabeth Colbert, and I'm sorry, I should have put the reference up here on the screen, but it's Why Facts Don't Change Our Minds. And it's in a February issue of the New Yorker, and I very much commend it to you as an interesting way to look at the issue. And as a case study, I would take you to a piece in the New York Times Magazine, How Fake News Turned a Small Town Upside Down. And you may be familiar with that, Twin Falls, Idaho, and that whole story is just an amazing case study. Or we can stay right here at home, and I wonder about the news item that came out during the weekend of Kevin Anderson, our athletic director, and how he'd been fired, there were all sorts of stories about that, and it would be interesting to parse that in terms of where we go with it. Where we would like to go in terms of managing this with our students is many of our students on campus take COM 107, which is our basic oral communication principles and practice course. And we do include material on listening, critical listening, empathetic listening in that course. And we're currently doing an assessment project to make some determination as to what is the impact coming into the course in contrast to coming out of the course, the 2,600 students who were enrolled in that course during the course of a semester. And hopefully that can make some difference. Although, as I had a conversation with my listening students this morning before I came here, I said, do we listen to fake news, and what channels are we really using, or is it more looking at fake news in terms of how much it's really being processed through the computer screen? Though there's, I'm sure, a model of digital listening that we can also move into, which would be another line of research. So, thank you for listening.
Okay, so we had 5 very interesting presentations on this topic, and we have quite a lot of time left for questions and discussion, so I hope some people will have some questions. If you could use the microphone, that would be good, because we're recording this. So who wants to ask a question?
Hi, I'm Ira Chenoy. I'm on the faculty in the College of Journalism. So we heard some very compelling research here, basically about why facts don't change minds. Decisions and what we believe to be true isn't based necessarily on facts. What's the research on what does change minds when somebody believes something that is patently untrue? Is there any research like that? Is it a research avenue? Where's that?
Well, I can at least add to what the research on the backfire effect has shown and the reasons why that these myths persist. One important aspect is what we call the familiarity effect, that often these myths are repeated over and over and over again. And so sometimes we mistakenly, in an attempt to address the myth, we repeat it. So we start by saying vaccines don't cause autism. But what the brain is hearing is vaccine autism, right? And you're reinforcing that. So we have to start by not indulging in the repetition of the myth and instead kind of address the ideas. And there are other nuances to this. The one other thing I'll mention up front is that we have to understand the role of the ego, and that when you're telling someone they're wrong, the way that feels is what you're saying is you're an idiot. And we need to back off of that. And we need to say, I understand why someone might have believed this based on the information that was available at the time. But now we have new information. We need to at least consider that. And so when we do it in a less threatening way, people tend to be more receptive. But that said, some people are so deeply entrenched that rational conversation is not really going to make an impact. But I believe on a wider scale, we will be more successful in getting facts out there if we do it in a non-confrontational, non-accusatory, non-worldview threatening way.
All right, so I have an interesting observation about that. So in my thesis, I also cited research about the backfire effect. It was not the same study that you had on the board up there, but it was one of the first ones and one of the most famous ones. And I had a very interesting segment on the NPR show On the Media about a month or so ago. The gold standard for one of the problems that you have when you're trying to win an argument is that you can present studies that show both sides. You can get competing studies and then you're confused, you don't know what the truth is. So the gold standard for research, whether it's in psychology or medicine or whatever, is repeatability, is that you can repeat the same experiment and get the same results. So the people who did this original backfire study, which is widely quoted, and I quoted in my thesis, when they went on to do further research, they couldn't duplicate the results, the dramatic results they got in the first one about the backfire effect. And so the question, it was an interesting question that arose because they were very famous for this study, and they were very emotionally invested in the study. They didn't want to be wrong, but they're scientists. And so in this, and I would recommend, you were recommending some things I've read both of those articles, all of those articles, by the way, they're really good. I would seek out this On the Media segment because it was very interesting, because when confronted with additional research that didn't support the backfire theory nearly as strongly as the original research, the scientists involved, whose name escaped me at the moment, but they're cited in my paper, said, yeah, I think you're right. I don't think we would say the same thing today based on what we had, which which gets to your point about having an open mind and being able to not being neutral in the sense that you give equal weight to both sides, but that you actually consider the evidence and make critical decisions, and also gets to your point about we're so invested in that. So, you have that. So I would invite you to go back and look at what the research says on that. Maybe we're wrong about the backfire effect. And one more interesting example of that, which I find fascinating. I find it fascinating when people confronted with facts do change their mind. There was a very famous sports medicine doctor in the 1970s named Dr. Gabe Mirkin. Does anybody know? Anybody remember that name? He's famous for coming up with a way of treating sports injuries, which went by the acronym, I think it was RICE. I think it was rest, ice, compression, elevation. And that was the best way to treat an injury. Well, in the decades since then, there's been a lot of research, and basically it shows that doesn't make any difference at all. Yes, it keeps the initial swelling down, but it doesn't stop the overall swelling. It just swells later. It doesn't heal any faster. It doesn't really have any effect at all. And so, and Dr. Gabe Mirkin, who made a career of this and wrote books about it, and it's like the big thing, when confronted with this evidence, also said, yeah, you're right. The data shows it doesn't really do anything. which to me is remarkable because, you know, as you said, the natural tendency is when you look at these things, you want to believe it. The things that you believe are things you really want to believe. It's very hard to admit you're wrong, to take new evidence, especially if there's a cost involved, if there's a political campaign or whatever. So I just throw that out because I find that those are fascinating examples of, in both cases, scientists who, I guess their faith in the scientific method was overruled their own ego and their own natural tendencies.
So let me take it on a different way. Imagine that you have a father that is hitting his son and you're observing. So you need to intervene. So are you talking to the father or are you talking to the son? So if you have someone that is a convinced partisan, that what he's trying to do is to deliver a fake message, why would you try to convince that person that he's trying to deliver a fake message? Then the question is whether, Trump, for example, believes some of the stuff that he's saying. Well, I'm actually pretty sure that he doesn't. I mean, there might be some that he does. So who are we talking to? So dispelling fake news for me is not for the convinced. It's not for those that are delivering the fake news. It's for those that are sensitive to the facts. So can you convince people that are sensitive to the facts? Absolutely. That means that we don't have to convince the one that is already convinced and what he's trying to do is to deliver a message that is knows that is fake because what he's trying to produce is a political operation. So are people that are tilted by connecting the dots in a way that makes a fake fact valid, can you convince them that connecting the dots in a different way is viable, is possible? And I think absolutely. Now, in that sense, what we have to do is to frame the fake facts as a political operation. I mean, you cannot disprove something has been created with a political motive without making evident that there's a political motive behind that. The discussion with the fake facts is to disclaim the intentionality of how the fake fact was created, not whether it is true. The fake fact was not created because it was true. It was created to produce a political result. What you disprove is the honest motivation of the message, not the message. The message was never in dispute. The people that are producing fake facts, for the most part, they don't believe those facts. They have created those to produce an effect. Why would you try to convince people that that's false? You only convince the ones that are actually receiving the message. That brings the other issue. Are fake facts delivered to convince anyone, or are fake facts delivered to increase the energy of the in-group? And if they're created to deliver energy within the in-group, then you're not trying to dismantle the fake facts because they're going to believe that fake facts. The question is whether they're mobilizing and they're energized and they're going to act on that fake fact because they want to produce a political result. So discussing fake facts as if it was just an information issue, which it is, but it's not just an information issue, because it's an information issue for people that are observing the debate, not for the people that are engaging in producing information or trying to debunk it.
Anybody else want to say anything? Okay, next question.
I'll stand on my tiptoes. I'm Judith Torney-Perda. I'm a retired professor, Department of Human Development, a developmental psychologist who studies youth civic engagement, among other things. I'm going to go back in time to when I was in high school, which was a long time ago, and I took a journalism course. And I think that journalism course taught me a set of ethics about journalists and journalism and the media, which was almost like you had to take a pledge of some sort, that you would treat facts in a certain way, that you would have disclaimers if you couldn't, and so on. What has happened to journalism? Because that doesn't seem to be what's happening, that particular wall of critical examination doesn't seem to be working anymore. I mean, is it just the internet that has sort of blown this up? Or has this been happening for a long time and we're just reaping the results of it now?
Well, as the journalist on the panel, I do think that the effect of the internet and the rise of all kinds of media that compete with what we would think of as traditional mainstream media has helped erode the confidence in media. But I'm also fond of saying that the news business is the only business that I know of in which competition can make the product worse. There are so many people out there competing for ideas. There's so much fake news, false news, just inaccurate news, that it does erode people's confidence. But I would submit, if you look at the stalwarts of the mainstream industry, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post, which are in a very interesting competition with each other these days to see who could be the preeminent paper, even some of the other, those standards that you learned in high school still apply, and journalists still try to apply them every day. I think the frustration among a lot of journalists is they're competing with people who don't hold those standards, and they're given equal credibility or sometimes more credibility. And I think that's the problem that we're sort of addressing here today.
One brief thing. So one thing that we're doing with Twitter that is quite interesting is, imagine that you have two news that are produced by the Washington Post. One of them frames a case as, a case of corruption, and the other one frames in a completely different frame the same political event. Then it goes to social media. So the number of times that one of them starts to circulate defines the framing of the article. So oftentimes you might have the same news outlet that is producing competing narratives, and one of them is taken by a community and circulated to the extreme. And when we see fake news, oftentimes it's not that you have a journalist that has produced data as bulk information, but someone that has reported that there was no plane crashing on the Pentagon, and that's taken by the community and propagates very rapidly. And suddenly we see that as fake news, and it was just part of a message, and it becomes dominant as a message. So journalists oftentimes, I think today journalism is done by people with character. I don't think that today if you talk to journalists, you have journalists that are more willing to compromise their principles than 20 or 30 years ago, at least the journalists that I know. So the question is, a lot of times part of the message that is coming out of media is absorbed and propagated in a way that didn't happen 20, 30 years ago. And that also changes how we perceive the media.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tarindra Ranasinghe, and I'm faculty at the Department of Accounting and Information Assurance at the Business School. I'm curious to know how you guys will respond to the notion that actually what we are seeing today is a sort of a democratization of fake news that used to be the monopoly of a government or some powerful institutions. And all the messiness that we are seeing today is essentially the inherent messiness of a democratization process. So since we typically believe that democracies are better than sort of autocracies in the long run, what we are seeing today is actually something that should be good in the long run.
I don't think that's quite the case. Let me put a couple of examples. I mean, in Twitter, the level of concentration of information is such that the Gini coefficient is about 0.7. That means that the people that are propagating messages in the internet are considerably more concentrated than any actor that we can think of in the economy. The reason that message concentrates is that social networks and the way the information is connected is dominated by higher nodes, like Trump or like Hillary Clinton or like the New York Times. So what happened is that in order for those news to become really dominant, they have to take up on the higher nodes. So that means that fake news, if we didn't have, for example, some outlets that are connected to a network that is politically and is trying to deliver that, it would not be able to propagate. So when those things propagate more readily, when those higher nodes are dominated by actors that are willing to propagate fake news. And democracy, I would say that for the most part is more challenge, and in authoritarian settings is less challenge. What we have today is not that there's a democratization of the creation of content. That is true. There's more content is created. But the fact is, we all speak in Twitter, but only a few of those are heard. I can put a tweet, but maybe 1,000 people are going to hear it. But Trump puts a tweet, and there's going to be millions of people hearing it. So the fake news that we're perceiving is not really dominated by individuals that are competed democratically. It's dominated by hard notes that are propagating the message. And while the concentration is huge, and we see that, I think, way more extreme than it used to before, not less.
I think the genius of Charles Dickens' opening line to Tale of Two Cities, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, is that it almost always seems to apply to the times that we're in. And in terms of the information, this really is the best and the worst of times. You know, the traditional thinking is that the marketplace of ideas, that we have freedom of expression, the more information, the better. In the marketplace of ideas, we'll sort through and pick out the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff. But the problem is the marketplace is now overloaded, it's crowded, it's polluted with a lot of other ideas, and it makes it more and more difficult for people to make those decisions. But to get back to something that you said, which I think really struck me, is, and I'm going to try to restate it in different terms, but I think it's the point you were making, is the problem with the fake news is not so much the purveyors of fake news, it's the consumers of fake news. In other words, it's you. You're the problem. To get back to what you were saying, we all need to be able to think more critically. The great thing about this democratization of ideas and information is that the information is all out there. If you want to understand whether or not when President Trump says that the Paris Climate Accords were a terrible deal for the United States, or that the Iran nuclear agreement is not going to contain Iran, that information is all there. You can seek it out. The problem is we're all overloaded. We all have gaps in our knowledge. We all have things that we don't know about. And we used to rely on a few news sources to sort of help sort it out for us. Now we're drinking from this fire hose, and it makes it much more difficult. And we're also, most of us are unaware of these cognitive biases that Dr. Roberts pointed out. The many ways that we're not even aware of how we absorb information and how our own biases. So the more we become aware of that, of how we think, how we take in information, the more desire we have to get the accurate information. It's all there. Nobody should be surprised at how President Trump has acted as president, because he made it really clear during the campaign exactly how he was going to be, and he's turned out to be exactly that way. So no one who voted for Donald Trump should say, boy, I'm really surprised at how he's acting as president. That information was all there. You could make that decision. So that's what I would say. Sure.
I would add to this conversation that I think the democratization of information is really powerful, and that more people being allowed to share their voices is not an inherently good or bad thing. It's just a reality of what we're dealing with. But I do not think that leads to the fact that we are experiencing more voices, because we tend to self-segregate in our information systems. So it's not even that we're not critically evaluating our sources, it's that algorithms are built by people that stop us from accessing information, so we don't even see it. So I think the conversation is so much larger than, are people contributing more in different perspectives? Are we seeing more in different perspectives? I think the way that we fundamentally are collecting, accessing, disseminating information is changing, and that's changing the conversation along with it. So I don't know, I would just add to that I think it's a much larger, more complex conversation maybe than just the people that are contributing those voices.
Yeah, everything is more complex, but the point that you're making is that I noticed this the other day, that on my Facebook feed, I have about 2,000 really close, intimate Facebook friends. And surprisingly, in the discussions that go on and most of the threads that are on my feed, most of my friends are pretty rational and reasonable. They all seem to sort of see things pretty much the way I do. And I realized, of course I am. That algorithm is showing me all the people who agree with me. So therefore I agree with them, and we all think we're geniuses, which apparently we're not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pizzalo. I'm a government and politics student here. And my question is simple. Now that we're aware of these unconscious biases, how can we personally account for them and deal with them when we're confronted with new information?
That one I think goes for
There is a lot of research evidence that I think paints a picture of of an individual trying to navigate the world being aware of their biases. And it doesn't mean that you will ever 100% be aware of or in control of these implicit reactions that happen in a fraction of a second. But if you start by trying to acknowledge them and reflect upon them and realize in the moment how that bias might be influencing you, you have a far better opportunity to correct for it. To put it in another context, they looked at employment decisions and how biases can affect decisions that individuals make when they're reviewing applicants. And what they found was that individuals that are convinced that they are objective, that they are unbiased, that they are truly egalitarian, made more biased decisions than individuals who acknowledge that they have some bias. And the reason for that is because we will immediately explain our decisions by a convenient explanation. And so if you don't particularly feel comfortable around a certain demographic of person, you'll find a legitimate reason to exclude them, even though the reason you wanted to exclude them was the bias. But if you acknowledge going into it, I recognize that I do have that this person reminds me of another person who I really struggled with. Okay, well, acknowledge that and then return to the more objective things. So in this, bringing that back to the processing of information in news and media, I think you need to always remind yourself, I do have certain biases, I do have certain assumptions. I am very likely to critique anything that suggests X, so that you at least are acknowledging it in the moment that you are trying to make a decision or evaluate something. You're far better able to be objective and critical about it.
So confirmation bias, which you mentioned, is the mother of all biases. We all suffer from confirmation bias. But there are hundreds of other, well, not hundreds, there are probably at least 100, other biases that we are subject to every day. And I'll just mention too that as a journalist, I encounter all the time. One of them, you probably heard this, correlation is not causation. One of the reasons that the false information about autism is so compelling to people is because they had a perfectly healthy child, they got a vaccine, and then they were diagnosed with autism. And the corollary of that is that we tend, as human beings, we tend not to believe in coincidences. If two things happen at the same time, it couldn't be a coincidence, not realizing how often that we're surrounded by coincidences all the time. So if I go sit on an airplane and the person, next to me has the same birthday as I do, I think, well, that's something. What are the chances of that? Well, the chances of it as an individual event are pretty small. If I'm betting whether I'm going to sit next to the plane with somebody with the same birthday, which, by the way, the odds are obviously 1 in 365, if you can do the math, or 366 perhaps. But so the chances of an individual event are rare, but the chances that somewhere in the universe of people flying on airplanes it's happening, it's almost a certainty. And we have so these are sort of thinking errors that we make all the time that sort of lead us in the wrong direction. And again, if we were suggesting reading the book Nudge by the guy whose name escapes me, because I'm not good at names, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, what's his name? Thaler, yes. That's a great book too, for understanding how we think about things and why we think we're rational human beings, but we make emotional decisions by our gut. And by the way, our president has pretty much said on many occasions that he likes to go with his gut. He had to be persuaded to stick with the strategy in Afghanistan because his gut told him to just get out. But his national security team spent months using facts and reason and arguments and things to convince him that maybe they should make some adjustments and stay with it. And so he went against his gut, which you have to give him some credit for.
Now I go to the political science part of this. We can go to therapy, it's true. But also, if you see bias, call bias. So we have in the last couple of years, maybe several of you have noticed that when there's a panel that is all male, there's anyone in the panel or outside tends to say, congratulations, you have an all-male panel. And doing that is not self-therapy and doesn't have to do with addressing our own biases, but call on biases and how it expressed. So when we think about biases that are presented by fake news, denouncing biases is important. Acknowledging those not just as problems that affect us, makes sense, because otherwise it's interesting. We tend to think that us, are biased, so we tend to be more lenient towards alternative narratives that might be valid, but at the same time, people that are strongly biased, and I take in fake news for granted for political purposes, supposedly they don't have to do anything. So I agree that we have to understand our own biases and call on them and try to fix them, but it's also true that fake news is not just about our own belief system and our own biases in perceiving how information is processed, but also it has political motives. So we should call bias. If you see bias, call bias. And that's as important. I think shaming people when they lie and they know that they're lying is actually right.
I really appreciate this question, and I'm really glad that you ask it. I think it's easy to vilify fake news when we imagine that we aren't complicit in that process. It's happening outside of us, and we're not perpetuating incorrect information. And information is always mediated by systems. So you don't just walk down the street and news articles fall on you. Like you interact with them through different systems, and part of it's just knowing how those work. So as a librarian, I know I go out to the stacks and books are organized by a classification system that is built by white men, and it's perceived through the perspective of white men. And so how we are valuing information and organizing it is filtered through that system. And I know that same thing for databases and the same thing for search engines. So it takes extra work to go outside and find different viewpoints. It's much harder to do that, to maintain that kind of awareness and to encourage the people around you. But as a government and politics person, I think you're also responsible for the information that you produce. So it's also making sure that what you're sending back into the world, that you're doing that critical evaluation, that you're taking the extra steps and encouraging the people around you. And I would agree that calling on bias when you see it is important, not to be a bystander, but to recognize your role within that process. Thank you for the question.
From a communication perspective, we start with intrapersonal communication. The idea to get to know yourself as a speaker, as a listener, where you're coming from, which would include, of course, an important bias check to know how that's framing the way that you're processing messages.
Hi, I'm David Cecilia from the History Department, and kind of on that last comment, so this is an interdisciplinary panel, and so, brings a lot of interesting, different perspectives, and that I think complement each other very nicely. On balance, I hear more kind of explanations that are based on the individual, the way the brain works, ego investment, and so on, and not so much on the social side. And to the extent that we've heard about the social side, it's been embedded in discussions about media, particularly social media. So I wonder if, say, we had a sociologist or maybe a historian on the panel, we would hear about social reference groups and people's actual daily contact with, real humans in their lives. It seems to me that what causes people to become very, very heavily invested in beliefs, facts to the contrary, are who they go to school with, who they meet at the hardware store, who they sit next to in church, real, actual people. It's very easy to just change the dial from Fox News to MSNBC and get confirmation that way, but to physically move. And so one of the trends that historians have been observing is the sorting of America along class and other lines in ways that now allow a person to go through his or her entire life without ever actually meeting someone who disagrees on some fundamental sort of political ideas. And so I wanted to kind of maybe, if we have different parts of the elephant here, I wanted to kind of introduce that part of the elephant too that I haven't, really heard much about today. Thanks.
I'd just like to say one thing about that. Excellent point.
I think this is where spaces like libraries come in that bring people different perspectives into one place where knowledge is intended to be democratic and egalitarian. So I think these community spaces are really important, and I think the role of educators that we have in that process is also important, so that we're bringing out these conversations in the classroom, that we're encouraging them in the kind of books that we're creating, and also in the knowledge that we're producing that's being filtered back down into mainstream news that's being turned into fake news in all different places. So I certainly take your point, and I think that it is important, but I do think as participators in higher education that we have a role in changing that and really encouraging those conversations. So I think we may have more of that here than we realize.
I also saw a recent poll that suggested that relatively few Democrats have very close friends who are Republicans, and very few Republicans have very close friends who are Democrats. I don't remember exactly where I saw it, but I believe it because it reinforces what I already believe, so therefore it must be true. But it does, my gut tells me it's true.
I'm David Glenn in the libraries. I want to thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. As several of the speakers have already mentioned, the various threads that were brought out, listening, which is something that I think we all probably need to work a lot harder on. I know even talking with my wife, I tend to be thinking about what I wanted to say in response before I finish hearing all she has to say, and I think that's very natural for all of us, and particularly if you're hearing somebody that you disagree with strongly. And I've been thinking about this problem, and I was thinking about back when I was a young man growing up, that we had really only 3 or maybe 4 networks that delivered most of the news that people watched on television, and you had people like Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley that were the major figures that most people in the country, if they had network news, it was one of those people that was presenting it. So everybody was hearing sort of the same thing. Now they'd have local newspapers, maybe that might be much more conservative or liberal, but and that the social media today has completely exploded that whole situation. But I think that one of the points that really came home to me, something that I already knew but was really hammered on here, is that in the end, I think we need to have dialogue. I think we need to listen to each other. I think we need to try and continue to present the truth so that it's out there for people that are seeking it. But in the end, the only person that can change what you believe, who you are, how you want to live, is yourself. You can't change anybody else. So it's up to us individually. And we just have to do the best we can to try and understand other people and to relate to other people and to exchange our views and try and help other people see what we believe and understand what they believe. But in the end, we're responsible for ourselves, and that's the way it's always going to be. Thank you.
And I'm compelled to say, amen.
Any other comments on that?
The general nature of my question is, what incentives can be enacted on like a national level to sort of mitigate these fake news like phenomenon? Like the details I get into is like on the media end, you have profit-seeking, efficient media organizations that are going to basically have a bias toward like giving people what they want to hear. But then on the other end, you have, say, coordinated state actors. We've seen with like Russia and MH17, this sort of like fire hose of falsehood propaganda model where they can just spew out enough stories that even if they mutually contradict each other, a large proportion of the population will end up believing some subset of these stories, even if mutually contradictory. So that's an aspect that's hard to counter. And then on the other end, you have, say, like nonprofits. Some might have their own interests where they'll like be biased towards specific issues. But on the other hand, sometimes you'll have think tanks, which will be fairly rigorous, but because they're not up to these same market incentives, they'll be much slower in outputting research. So by the time they put out like one memo, there's like thousands of fake news stories cycling. So how do we either incentivize the more rigorous institutions to become competitive enough to compete with that, or how do we penalize fake news enough that it like doesn't spread? Is there something like on the media end where perhaps different media organizations could be compared via things like prediction markets or things with like objective metrics that like you'd broadcast in the media, and then like that would work out, or would that also just be subject to the same set of biases, and then this is like a really intractable problem?
Just quickly, in my thesis, I looked at three possible corrective things that we could do. One was better journalism, more fact, knowledge-based journalism. One was more fact-checking, which you've seen, and I wrote my thesis more than 5 years ago, so there's been a big rise in fact-checking since then. And the last one I looked at was increased emphasis on critical thinking, particularly in college courses. And I pretty much dismissed 1 and 2 as ineffective. Not that we shouldn't have better journalism or more fact-checking, but they just have a very limited ability to do more. I mean, the president said yesterday that his predecessor, President Obama, didn't call troops who had been killed in combat. And the Post tried to fact check that today and basically said, the president says, well, I've called every single person, and he didn't. Like that's the measure. And so they can fact check that all day, and it's not going to change anybody's belief on that. So anyway, I come back to the idea of developing our critical thinking skills. I think that in this, huge pool of all kinds of information, that's you don't have to be that smart to figure out the things that are actually true. That's my opinion.
So there are only few occasions in which fake news really becomes this explosive. So a lot of people mention, for example, Germany and Nazi Germany. A lot of people mention 1850s in the US before the Civil War. And I think that there's a reason. I mean, it is true that polarization at some points tends to be sufficiently strong so that you are willing to take on news that are going on a reputation. But the graph that I was showing in the beginning, I was showing that Democrats still have more confidence in traditional media than Republicans. Notice that at some point in the Republicans, that's a problem. I mean, you can have fake news for a certain while, but the truth is that the group that believes that the news are fake, that are willing to attack those outlets, are losing access to information. And the more you call in on that bias, that misinformation, and that stupidity, to put it that way, because that's at the end how you're calling the other one, it produces a penalty. And I think that's why these fake news events generally flare, and they flare up. They don't stay steady. It's very difficult to maintain this kind of fake news discourse over long periods of time. So how do you deal with that? Well, I think that you deal the way that we are dealing with that, which is you talk about that, you discuss about that, you shame people when they say things that are false, etc., and you organize politically, but not by regulating fake news through government intervention. I think that you can't do that without going against freedom of expression, and by the end providing tools that are actually used for the most part by authoritarian leaders to impose narratives that are contrary to what we think in democracy. But I think that fake news are self-defeating. The problem is the damage they produce in the meantime.
I would just add really quickly to this conversation, proprietary access to information. So I think there's two things that are happening, and one is sort of the reification of scholarly sources as if they are more rigorous and do not have flaws like other sources, which is sort of its own problem. But the other is that if what you're talking about is putting information like that behind a paywall that people can't have access to, that's inherently cutting people off from expanding their source of knowledge. So I think you fix that by funding libraries. I think you fix it by promoting open access publication, by putting things in repositories, by democratizing access to information so that people can get to the kind of rigorous fact-check sources that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm actually one of Professor Calvo's students. I have kind of a simple but maybe complicated question. I kind of just want to know if you all think that this phenomena is going to get worse, or if it's just going to hold steady. I don't know. Are we doomed to live in a world of fake news, or is it just going to stay the way it is?
That's a very good question. Who was it who said making predictions is really hard, especially about the future? But I think the trend line, right now the trend line is not positive. in terms of the growth of fake news. There's more and more of it, and it depends on how you define fake news. As things that are completely made up, or just inaccurate reporting, or things that are can be proven. But it doesn't seem to be going away. I don't see it going away anytime soon. Whether it's going to continue to grow, well, everything seems to grow these days. So I'm just guessing it's not. The trend is going to continue the direction it's going. That's my guess.
Just to have a debate. We noticed a couple of things after the election here and election in Argentina, the election in Brazil that were interested, which is when they peak bad news. We started to see that people were holding on and retweeting and reposting things in Facebook that their friends were putting. I imagine that all of us received some fake news that we retweeted or shared with colleagues, and someone would say, that's not true. How many of you have received that kind of in your Facebook? No? So what we're seeing is that people are exercising more control on their walls and more control on Facebook, and more control on how, the kind of things that they're sharing with the community. So at least from the part of the users, I think we peaked. From the part of creating news, maybe not, but I think that there's significant more self-control after fake news has become such a prominent news, that people, when they receive something, now they're starting to check way more than they were a couple of years ago. And we're seeing that not just in the US, I think we're seeing that in a lot of social media users in very heavily polarized environments. So hopefully we peak and we're starting to go downhill, but I agree with what my colleague was saying. We're still a long way from.
I think the big change, and you've probably seen this, is that used to be you'd hear something in the news, Michael Jackson died or something, and you'd say, wow, Michael Jackson died, that's really sad. Now you say, gee, Michael Jackson, I wonder if he really died. I guess I'll wait and find out. There's a much higher level of skepticism about anything you hear, and of course the more outrageous and anger-inducing it appears to be, it's usually less likely to be true. And I do think people are developing more of a healthy skepticism. And one of the good things about this explosion, this free marketplace, is that there is a self-correcting nature to it. People do fact-check things and run them down and point them out when they're not true. And so, as Dickens said, it's the best and worst of times.
I would just very quickly add, there has been psychological warfare since the beginning of warfare, and it was initially very contained and coordinated, right? Now everyone else can get in the game, and I think I totally agree that we, having thought about this, are more likely to see that thing come up and go, huh, and then search for it and find out, is this really being reported in a reputable way? But there are more and more people that are engaging more and more in social media, and now I think there are going to be more and more people that seize on the opportunity, and the sophistication of that fake news, of that psychological warfare is going to increase with it. So I think it's going to be an arms race of information and skepticism, and I have a hard time imagining that it's ever going to just disappear.
Thank you.
We'll have maybe two more questions and then we should.
Okay, hi, I'm Lindsay Inge Carpenter. I'm from the libraries, and I had a question for you from your role, right, perspective as educators. So like Rachel mentioned, all of these questions are tied up in very complicated systems, and so in the media I see a lot of times students being criticized as the ones who fail to understand these systems. But as we've been talking about today, that's really not true. It's adults, it's people of all ages, because they're complicated. And so I was wondering if you had some strategies that you use in your own classrooms, like activities or assignments that you do to talk to your students about construction of knowledge or talking about how to critically evaluate information. And then as a follow-up to that, I also wondered if you had ideas for ways that we could share that in the UMD community. I know that the library says the digital repository for University of Maryland, or DRUM, but I wasn't sure if there were other like repositories like that on campus where we could share teaching materials.
Sorry, I've been hugging the microphone. But I do. We start our comparative class. I teach one on tweeting political crisis. A couple of my students were here. But I teach one on comparative politics. We start with discussing the news. The first question that they need to answer always is who's the recipient of the message. And with fake news, the moment that you argue who's the recipient of the message, the interpretation of the content changes dramatically. So I think that discussing explicitly not the article, but who produces and who receives it and why it was to be received in a certain particular way, it helps clarify a lot how students are taking on news that are false, much more than trying to show that they are actually false. That's generally simpler.
It's very much at the core of our curriculum in Com 107 and other communication courses. And we look at it from the standpoint of both the speaker and the receiver, the listener. And there are lots of units, lots of material, and that's an interesting idea to share. We have an oral communication center, and we do workshops, and I have lots of different kinds of activities that are available not just to students enrolled in our courses, but also to the campus community. And yeah, we should talk.
They can also all take Psych 100. We learned about the confirmation bias there.
Thank you.
One more question.
Sorry. Thank you. My name is Ashley Federoff. I'm an alum of the Information School, and I'm a high school librarian nearby. So I'm approaching this fake news and alternative facts with the mindset of trying to teach high schoolers how to understand this particular issue. And I'm just really interested in what Ms. Gammons and Dr. Roberts have to say about training students to push past that 1/20th of a second judgment, and also any specific skills that they might be able to learn to understand their own biases better, which is really tough with teenagers. Thanks. Well, we have teenagers too. So our freshmen were high schoolers 3 months ago. So I think that we are on the same team there. It's hard, right? And what I like about critical information literacy is it really acknowledges humans as fragile and these systems as difficult and complex, and acknowledging that you are not information literate one day. You don't just wake up and know how to do everything. It's a process that you keep building and developing. And what we really focus on is asking questions. So rather than pulling up a checklist and saying, is it credible, is it authoritative, does it have a purpose or not, it's why was that created? What do you know about this person? How would you find out more information? So every answer they have, you have another question. And building those skills, I think it takes time, right? So you practice it over and over and over again, and sometimes you don't do it right, and that's okay. So also having those supportive communities where you can get feedback on what you're doing, right? So if you're evaluating a source, having multiple people engaging in that conversation, and really having the opportunity to check each other so you can make sure that you're bringing in more voices into that conversation and you're not relying solely on yourself. All of those things I'm sure you are doing, because I'm sure you're a wonderful librarian. I'm interested to see what Scott says about bias and sort of questioning those things. But in terms of information, I think it's just practicing asking questions.
Scott is glad he teaches at the college level and that he's not a high school librarian. I commend you for your work. I think we've been battling misinformation and fake news among teenagers forever, right? There's all sorts of myths that they hear from their friends, like you can't get pregnant if X, whatever X is. It's atrociously wrong. And these conspiracies, yeah. So, I think in terms of critical skills, I think at a very basic level, teaching them how to ask themselves questions as they see something like, if someone was trying to manipulate me, who might it be and to what end? And if it's possible that this person was misinformed, how would I go about, what would be the next step? Just getting them to think through what that process might look like and even practice that, I think can be helpful. It's not going to combat every instance, but I think that if you can at least teach them, when I see a news story, I ask myself, why would they want me to believe this? And if I have any questions about whether it's true, this is what I would go do next. I think we need to teach those skills to elementary school students. We need to teach it early on, and that's it's not as maybe high end as what we typically think about as critical thinking at the university level, but it's that critical skepticism that at least gives them a fighting chance to react to something without just buying in.
Okay, that's going to be the last comment. We have one more piece of business.
Yeah, thank you all for your tweets. There were a lot of great tweets coming through. We did want to award Ashley Federoff, who asked that last great question, with the 3D printed test studio from our makerspace on the second floor.